corporate events were always a balancing act for me. As the head of the company, I had to navigate the fine line between being approachable and maintaining authority. Tonight's annual office party was no exception. The banquet hall buzzed with laughter, clinking glasses, and bursts of conversation as I moved from one group of employees to another, exchanging pleasantries and politely dodging any overly personal questions. But it wasn't the usual work chatter or the lingering taste of the champagne that held my attention tonight. It was him. He stood by the bar, effortlessly blending into the crowd, yet commanding an undeniable presence. He wasn't the loudest or the most flamboyant, but his charisma was magnetic. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, relaxed yet confident, or the quick, knowing smiles he gave in response to conversations. Whatever it was, I caught myself glancing at him more than I should have. I shouldn't have felt anything. After all, I had a husband waiting at home, a good man, reliable and kind. But as I watched this young man, my newest team member, something stirred inside me. It was a faint whisper of excitement, a reminder of desires I had neatly packed away over the years. "Not enjoying the party, are we?" His voice broke through my thoughts. I hadn't noticed him approach, but now he was there, standing close enough for his cologne to reach me. It was subtle, woodsy, and far too alluring. "Of course I am," I said with a practiced smile. "These events are part of the job." "Funny," he replied, tilting his head slightly. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else." His candor caught me off guard. Most people treaded carefully around me, but he didn't seem intimidated by my position. Instead, he leaned in, his tone teasing but not disrespectful. "Let me guess," he continued. "You've heard enough about spreadsheets and quarterly goals to last a lifetime." I laughed, surprising myself. "You're not wrong." "Well," he said, extending his hand, "how about a break from all that? Dance with me." For a moment I hesitated. The room felt smaller, the chatter fading into the background. I could feel the weight of my own rules pressing against me. Dancing with an employee, especially one who was years younger, was crossing a line. But the way he looked at me with a mixture of confidence and curiosity made it hard to say no. "Just one dance," I finally said, placing my hand in his. The music shifted to a slow, sultry rhythm as we moved to the dance floor. I could feel the eyes of my colleagues on us, but I didn't care. His hand rested lightly on my waist, his touch warm but not intrusive. As we swayed to the music, an electric charge seemed to build between us. "Relax," he murmured, his voice low and soothing. "No one's judging you." His words were meant to comfort, but they only heightened my awareness of the situation. My skin tingled where his fingers graced the fabric of my dress. It wasn't an overtly sensual moment. There was nothing inappropriate about the way we danced, but it awakened something in me. Something I hadn't felt in years. When the song ended, I pulled back, needing to regain control. "Thank you for the dance," I said, my voice steady but guarded. "The pleasure was mine," he replied, his smile lingering. "You should let yourself enjoy life more often." His words echoed in my mind as I drove home later that night. My husband was already asleep when I arrived, his soft snores filling the quiet of our bedroom. I slipped out of my dress, carefully hanging it in the closet, and climbed into bed beside him. As I stared at the ceiling, the memory of the dance replayed in my mind. It wasn't the dance itself that unsettled me, it was the way it made me feel. Alive, desired, and utterly conflicted. Tomorrow, I told myself, it would be back to business as usual. But deep down I knew something had shifted. And there was no going back. The office felt different that morning. The usual hum of keyboards and muted phone conversations blended into the background noise, but my attention was fractured. Every time I glanced up from my desk, my eyes seemed to wander toward the far end of the room, where he sat. He didn't look up often, busy typing away on his laptop, his brow furrowed in concentration. Yet when he did meet my gaze, there was an unspoken acknowledgement in his eyes, a faint spark that reminded me of the night before. I forced myself to focus on the task at hand. The quarterly review presentation loomed over my schedule like a thundercloud. As the team lead, it was my responsibility to ensure every department met its goals, and this review would decide the company's next steps. That pressure usually kept me grounded, but today it felt secondary. "Do you have a moment?" His voice broke my concentration. I looked up to find him standing by my desk, holding a stack of documents. "Yes," I replied, gesturing to the chair across from me. "What's on your mind?" He sat down, his movements relaxed but deliberate. I need your approval on these figures. We're making adjustments to the projections for next quarter, and I wanted to make sure they align with your expectations. I scanned the papers quickly, nodding at his attention to detail. This looks solid. You're thorough. Only because I know you expect nothing less, he said, his tone light but laced with sincerity. I smiled faintly, but his words lingered. It wasn't just a compliment. It was the way he said it, as though he genuinely cared about meeting my standards. For a fleeting moment I wondered if he viewed me as more than just his boss. Thank you. I'll take these to the board, I said, handing the documents back. He didn't leave immediately. Instead he leaned slightly forward, his eyes locking onto mine. You seemed different last night, he said, his voice lower now. Not in a bad way. Just different. My chest tightened. I'm not sure what you mean. He shrugged lightly, a faint smirk playing on his lips. Maybe I just saw a side of you most people don't. You seemed freer. The words settled over me like a warm, unwelcome weight. I didn't respond, instead choosing to glance at my monitor, a silent cue for him to leave. But he didn't move. I'm sorry if I crossed a line, he said after a pause. That wasn't my intention. You didn't, I replied quickly, too quickly. But it's important we maintain professionalism. Of course, he said, standing. But professionalism doesn't mean we can't enjoy a moment, does it? Before I could answer, he was gone, leaving me alone with the echo of his words. Enjoy a moment. The phrase rang in my ears, challenging the rigid boundaries I'd built around my life. That evening, as the office emptied, I found myself still at my desk, poring over the quarterly report. The sound of a chair scraping against the floor drew my attention. He was still here too. Burning the midnight oil? I asked, my voice carrying across the quiet room. He chuckled softly. Someone has to make sure this presentation is flawless. I smiled despite myself. Dedication suits you. So does working late, he countered, walking toward my desk. But I'm guessing you don't have anyone waiting for you at home tonight? I froze, his words hitting too close to a truth I didn't want to admit. My husband was home, of course, but the distance between us felt insurmountable. I looked up at him, his expression unreadable but his eyes probing, as though he already knew the answer. It's just work, I said finally, brushing off his comment. Sometimes it takes priority. He nodded but didn't move. The silence between us grew heavier, like a taut string waiting to snap. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Sometimes priorities change. Before I could react, he leaned down, his face close to mine. His hand grazed the edge of my desk, steadying himself as he paused, waiting. I knew I should have stopped him, said anything, but I didn't. The air between us felt charged, electric. And then it happened. His lips brushed mine, tentative at first, as though he wasn't sure if I'd pull away. But I didn't. The kiss deepened, slow and deliberate, and for a moment the world outside my office disappeared. When I finally pulled back, my heart was racing. This was a mistake, I said, my voice trembling. Was it? He asked, his tone soft but unyielding. Or was it inevitable? I didn't answer. I couldn't. Instead, I gathered my things and left the office, the weight of his words following me out into the night. The drive to the conference was uneventful at first, filled with the kind of polite small talk I had perfected over the years. The highway stretched out ahead of us, the gray morning sky reflecting my muddled thoughts. He was in the passenger seat, his sleeves rolled up to the elbows, exposing strong forearms that caught my attention more than I wanted to admit. How long have you been in the industry? He asked, breaking the silence. Long enough to know it's never predictable, I replied, keeping my eyes on the road. It was a safe answer, carefully measured like most of my interactions with him. But I felt his gaze linger, probing for something deeper. Do you ever miss the unpredictability? His voice was calm, but the question carried weight. What do you mean? He shifted in his seat, leaning slightly toward me. I mean, doesn't the routine ever get to you? Meetings, deadlines, expectations. It's all so structured. Don't you ever want to just let go? The question hung in the air, heavier than it should have been. I hesitated, unsure of how much truth to reveal. Routine isn't always a bad thing, I said finally. It keeps things stable. But stability can be stifling, he countered, his tone soft but pointed. Sometimes breaking the rules is the only way to feel alive. I didn't respond, but his words struck a nerve. My life had been built on structure and control, but the cracks in that foundation were starting to show. And he seemed to see them clearer than I did. The conference venue was an upscale hotel on the outskirts of the city. The lobby buzzed with professionals exchanging business cards and pleasantries, the polished marble floors amplifying their footsteps. I checked us in and handed him his keycard without meeting his eyes. "Thank you," he said, his fingers brushing mine as he took the card. The brief contact sent a jolt through me, but I quickly pulled my hand away. "We have a packed schedule," I said, my tone brisk. "Let's stay focused." "Of course," he replied, but his smirk suggested he wasn't taking my words entirely seriously. The day passed in a blur of presentations and panel discussions. I kept my distance, sticking to my role as the composed professional. But every now and then I caught his eye across the room, and each glance felt like a silent conversation. By the time the evening networking event rolled around, I was exhausted, not just from the day's agenda, but from the effort it took to keep my thoughts in check. The hotel's rooftop bar was dimly lit, with panoramic views of the city sparkling below. I stood by the railing, nursing a glass of wine, when I felt his presence beside me. "Long day," he said, leaning casually against the railing. "Very," I replied, not looking at him. The city lights blurred in my vision as I focused on the glass in my hand. "You don't have to be on guard all the time, you know," he said, his voice low. "It's okay to just be." His words were disarming, and I hated how easily they pierced through my defenses. "I'm not on guard," I said, but the lie sounded hollow even to me. He smiled knowingly. "You are. But I get it. Expectations, right?" "Expectations are part of the job," I said, finally meeting his gaze. "You wouldn't understand." "Maybe not your job," he admitted, "but I understand more than you think. And for what it's worth, you don't have to carry all of it alone." The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, we stood in silence, the city stretching out beneath us. Later that night, as I lay in my hotel room, his words played over and over in my mind. I hated how they made me feel seen, vulnerable in a way I hadn't allowed myself to be in years. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, a message from him. "You looked beautiful tonight. Sleep well." My breath caught as I read the words. I knew I should delete the message, ignore it, pretend it never happened. But instead I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Finally I typed a response. "Thank you. Good night." I set the phone down, my heart pounding as I turned off the light. The line between us had blurred even further, and I wasn't sure I had the strength, or the will, to redraw it. I sat at my desk, flipping through the blueprints for our latest project. The lines and measurements blurred together, a monotonous pattern that matched the dragging hours of the day. The office was quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioner and the occasional distant murmur of conversations in the hall. It was the kind of day where every task felt heavier than it should. My focus drifted, my thoughts circling back to the conference trip and the message he'd sent that night. I had told myself to put it behind me, to redraw the line that had blurred far too much already. But now, back in the office, the clarity I had promised myself seemed like a distant goal. A knock at the door broke my reverie. It was him. He stepped into my office holding a large box in his arms, the weight of it making him shift slightly as he walked. "These are the materials for the new project," he said, his voice steady but quiet. There was a hint of something unspoken in his tone, perhaps lingering awkwardness from the trip or maybe just my imagination. He set the box down on the edge of my desk, but as he adjusted its placement, the corner caught against the surface. A few samples spilled out, scattering onto the floor with a dull clatter. "Sorry," he said quickly, kneeling to gather them up. His movements were swift but not rushed. There was a certain grace to the way he worked, despite the situation. I watched him, my eyes following the way his brow furrowed in concentration. There was an earnestness in his expression, a quiet determination to fix the small mistake. It was such a simple moment, yet I found myself caught in it, my mind wandering to places it shouldn't. He picked up one of the samples, a sleek piece of textured material, and paused. Running his fingers over its surface, he seemed lost in thought. "Interesting," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "I never thought it would feel like this." The comment was so absent-minded and unguarded that it pulled me out of my thoughts. I smiled, intrigued by his curiosity. "What do you mean?" I asked. He looked up at me, holding the material out for me to take. I guess I just didn't expect it to have so much depth, he said. The texture's subtle, but you can feel the detail if you really pay attention. I took the sample from him, my fingers brushing against his as I did. The contact was brief, fleeting, but it sent a ripple through me. I turned the piece over in my hands, running my own fingers along the surface. It's a good reminder, I said, my voice quieter than I intended. Every detail matters. For a moment we both seemed caught in the stillness of the room. His eyes lingered on me, not inappropriately, but with an intensity that made the air between us feel heavier. I cleared my throat, breaking the spell. Let's get the rest of these back in the box. He nodded, and together we placed the remaining samples neatly into the container. When we finished, I glanced at him and noticed a faint tension in his posture. Relax, I said gently. It's just a box of materials. No need to be so hard on yourself. He smiled, a small but genuine expression that softened his features. Thanks, he said, standing up and brushing off his hands. I just didn't want to make a bad impression. You're doing fine, I reassured him, leaning back in my chair. Just remember, no one's expecting perfection. He nodded again, his shoulders easing slightly as he picked up the box. I'll take this back to the team, he said, pausing for a moment before adding, and, thanks. For not making it a bigger deal. I waved him off, offering a faint smile. It's nothing. As he left, the room felt a little emptier. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a slow breath. The moment had been so ordinary, so mundane on the surface, yet it lingered in my mind long after it ended. There was something about him. His quiet focus, his genuine curiosity, that made even the smallest interactions feel charged with meaning. I shook my head, trying to push the thoughts away. There were boundaries to maintain, rules to follow. But as the door clicked shut behind him, I couldn't ignore the faint pull I felt, drawing me toward something I knew I should resist. The office was unusually quiet that evening. Most of the team had left hours ago, leaving the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the distant ticking of the wall clock to fill the silence. I stayed behind, buried in revisions for the project's final pitch. My focus, however, was slipping. Every time I tried to immerse myself in the work, my mind drifted back to the moments we'd shared. The rooftop conversation, the stolen glances, the charged silence of the spilled materials. I tried to reason with myself. It was nothing. Just a passing phase of restlessness, brought on by the monotony of life. But deep down I knew it was more than that. The sound of footsteps pulled me from my thoughts. He was still here. His tie hung loosely around his neck, and his sleeves were rolled up as he stepped into the office with a cup of coffee in hand. You're still working? He asked, leaning casually against the doorframe. So are you, I replied, not looking up. Touché, he said, stepping closer and placing the coffee cup on my desk. Thought you could use a break. I glanced at the cup, then at him. Thanks, I said, though I wasn't sure if I meant the coffee or the thought behind it. For a moment he stood there, his presence filling the room in a way that felt far too intimate for an office. You work too hard, he said finally, his voice softer now. You don't have to carry everything by yourself, you know. I'm used to it, I replied, keeping my tone neutral. It's part of the job. But it doesn't have to be, he said, his eyes locking onto mine. You don't always have to be the one in control. His words hung in the air, challenging the carefully constructed walls I'd built around myself. I looked away, pretending to be engrossed in the documents on my desk, but I could feel his gaze on me. Why are you really still here? I asked, breaking the silence. I could ask you the same thing, he replied, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. But if you're asking, I stayed because I wanted to see you. His honesty caught me off guard. I looked up at him, searching his face for a hint of insincerity, but there was none. The room suddenly felt smaller, the distance between us shrinking even though neither of us had moved. You shouldn't say things like that, I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. Why not? He asked, taking a step closer. Because it's true? Or because you feel the same way? I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. The air between us crackled with unspoken tension, a pull that felt impossible to resist. He moved closer, his hand resting lightly on the edge of my desk as he leaned in. I know you feel it too, he said, his voice steady but low. You don't have to admit it, but I know. I wanted to argue, to deny it, but the truth was too loud to ignore. Before I could think, he closed the gap between us. His lips brushed against mine, tentative at first, as though he was giving me the chance to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. The kiss deepened, slow and deliberate, as though we both knew the weight of what we were doing. My heart raced, every nerve in my body alive with sensation. His hand rested on my cheek, his touch warm and steady, grounding me even as everything else felt like it was spinning out of control. When we finally pulled apart, the room was silent except for the sound of our breathing. I stared at him, my mind a whirlwind of emotions, guilt, desire, fear, and something else I couldn't quite name. "This is wrong," I said, my voice trembling. "Maybe," he said, his gaze steady. "But it doesn't feel wrong." I shook my head, pushing back from the desk and standing. "It doesn't matter how it feels. We can't do this." He didn't argue, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't giving up. "If that's what you want," he said quietly. "It's what has to happen," I said, more to convince myself than him. I grabbed my bag and walked out of the office, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. But as I stepped into the cool night air, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted irrevocably. There was no going back now. The next morning, I walked into the office with a carefully composed expression. I'd spent the entire night rehearsing the lines I'd used to rebuild the walls I had let crumble. Professionalism, distance, control. They had always been my shields, and I intended to use them again. But as soon as I stepped inside, I felt the weight of his presence. He was at his desk, typing something on his laptop, his expression focused. There was nothing unusual about the scene, yet my chest tightened. I could still feel the warmth of his lips on mine, the unspoken promises that kiss had carried. I forced myself to move past him, my heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. "Good morning," I said in a clipped tone, barely meeting his eyes. "Good morning," he replied, his voice calm, almost neutral. But as our gazes briefly met, I saw the flicker of something, an acknowledgement of what had passed between us. I shut the door to my office and exhaled, trying to steady my thoughts. Work was my escape, my refuge. I dove into emails, schedules, anything to keep my mind occupied. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the memory of the kiss, or the realization of what it meant. By mid-afternoon, my husband called. His voice was warm, steady as he told me about his day. He asked if I wanted to have dinner together, just the two of us. There was a softness in his tone, a quiet longing that I hadn't heard in a long time. "Sure," I said, feeling a pang of guilt that threatened to drown me. "That sounds nice." As I hung up, I stared at the phone in my hand. My husband was a good man. He had always been kind, supportive, and patient with me. Yet in that moment, all I could think about was how I hadn't felt truly seen by him in years. I thought about the moments when he would sit next to me on the couch, scrolling through his phone, while I longed for him to ask me how I was really feeling. The quiet dinners where we exchanged pleasantries but rarely delved deeper. It wasn't that he didn't care, he did. But somewhere along the way we had stopped connecting. And then there was him. The way he looked at me, like he saw through every layer I tried to hide behind. The way he challenged me made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. It terrified me, but it also exhilarated me. Later that evening, as I was packing up to leave, he appeared at my office door. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. I hesitated. "I don't think that's a good idea." "Please," he said, stepping inside. "Just for a minute." I set my bag down, crossing my arms as I faced him. "What is it?" He closed the door behind him, leaning against it as he searched for the right words. "I know you think last night was a mistake. Maybe it was. But I can't pretend it didn't happen." "We have to pretend," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "This isn't. It can't go anywhere." "Why not?" he asked, his tone challenging. "Because it's wrong? Or because you're scared of what it means?" His words cut through me, raw and unfiltered. I opened my mouth to argue, but the truth lodged in my throat. I was scared of the feelings he stirred in me, scared of what they said about my marriage, about myself. "This is my life," I said finally, my voice trembling. "I've built it carefully, piece by piece. I can't risk throwing it all away for this." He stepped closer, his eyes locked onto mine. "I'm not asking you to throw anything away. I'm asking you to be honest, with me and with yourself." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I wanted to argue, to push him away, but the part of me that longed for something more, something real, kept me rooted in place. "I can't do this," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "You already are," he said, his voice steady but soft. "Whether you admit it or not." He turned and left, leaving me standing there, my heart pounding and my mind racing. The line I had tried so hard to redraw had vanished completely, and I was left standing on unsteady ground, unsure of which way to turn. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of my office as I sat at my desk, staring at the stack of reports in front of me. The words blurred together, meaningless against the storm brewing in my mind. Last night's conversation with him had left me shaken, teetering on the edge of a decision I wasn't ready to face. I glanced toward his desk, but it was empty. A pang of disappointment shot through me before I could stop it. Shaking my head, I forced myself to focus. The day was packed with meetings and deadlines, and I couldn't afford to let my personal chaos interfere. But the quiet didn't last long. A knock on my door pulled me from my thoughts. I straightened my posture, forcing calm into my voice. "Come in." It wasn't him. Instead, my assistant stepped in, holding an envelope. "This was left on your desk earlier this morning," she said, placing it down before leaving. I stared at the envelope for a long moment before picking it up. My name was scrawled across the front in his handwriting. My heart raced as I opened it, unfolding the single sheet of paper inside. "I know you think this is the end, but it doesn't have to be. I'll leave if that's what you want, but before I go, I needed you to know. You've changed me. You've reminded me what it feels like to care, to want something real. If nothing else, I hope you find that for yourself. You deserve it." The words hit me like a tidal wave, each sentence pulling me deeper into a sea of guilt, longing, and regret. I folded the letter and placed it in my drawer, locking it away as though that could keep the emotions at bay. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Meetings came and went, conversations filtered through my ears without sticking. When I finally returned to my office, the sky outside had turned a deep shade of orange, the sun setting on another day I couldn't fully remember. I sat in the silence, the weight of his words pressing down on me. He hadn't come back to his desk, and the emptiness of his absence felt sharper than I expected. My phone buzzed on the desk. A message from my husband. "Dinner's ready. Can't wait to see you." The simplicity of his words made my chest tighten. He had no idea of the storm inside me, the choices I was grappling with. For him, everything was normal, stable, predictable. And maybe that was the problem. When I got home, he was waiting at the door, smiling as he pulled me into a hug. "You look tired," he said, concern in his eyes. "Long day." "You could say that," I replied, forcing a smile. "Dinner's ready," he said, leading me to the dining room. The table was set beautifully, candles flickering in the soft light. He had made my favorite dish, the effort clear in every detail. As we sat across from each other, I watched him. He talked about his day, about a project he was working on, his face lighting up with excitement. I nodded, offering the right responses, but my mind was elsewhere. He had always been good to me. Reliable, steady, a man who built his life around making mine easier. But as I sat there, I realized how much of myself I had buried over the years, how much I had sacrificed for the sake of harmony. The passion, the excitement, the sense of being truly alive. It had all faded, and I hadn't even noticed. "Are you okay?" he asked, his brow furrowed. "I'm fine," I lied, picking at my food. "Just tired." He reached across the table, taking my hand in his. His touch was warm, familiar, but it didn't spark anything in me. Not like. I pulled my hand away, forcing another smile. "I think I need an early night." As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I thought about everything. My marriage, my career, him. The choices I had made, the lines I had crossed, and the ones I was still afraid to cross. The letter he had left echoed in my mind, his words a reminder of what I was running from and toward at the same time. I didn't have answers. Not yet. But I knew one thing for certain. The person I had been before all this, the one who thrived on routine and control, was gone. In her place was someone new, someone still figuring out what it meant to truly live. As the first light of dawn crept into the room, I closed my eyes, knowing the road ahead would be anything but simple. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally awake.